You're listening to the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Bill McIntyre, and it's time for this week's Long Island News, the show that talks to newsmakers from Nassau and Suffolk County that matter to Long Island and Long Islanders like you. So each week we'll have a conversation about issues that affect all of us. I live on Long Island just like you, and I want to know more about where my tax dollars are going, and I want to know more about the people making the big decisions that affect us all. Well, the show this week would never have aired even just a year or two ago. Today's topic is the legalization of marijuana and how it affects us here on Long Island. And my guest today is Trivette Knowles, the Public Affairs Press Officer and Manager of Community Outreach at the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. Well, Trivette, welcome to this week's Long Island News.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Bill.
No, with this topic, everybody's got a question. Everybody
Absolutely
has a question. And like we said, a year or two ago, we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Yeah.
So the website for your office states that the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act created this first in the nation comprehensive regulatory structure to oversee the licensure, cultivation, production, distribution, sale, and taxation of medical, adult use, and cannabinoid hemp within New York State. Wow, that's a mouthful.
Absolutely.
What exactly does the department do in layman's terms?
So that's a great question. So again, I work with the New York State Office of Cannabis Management, and we call it the OCM, just for all intents and purposes. So what the Office of Cannabis Management, OCM, does in layman's terms is pretty much oversee the legalization and the implementation of the marketplace. So we're in charge of making cannabis legal and licensed. So before cannabis, as he said, a couple years ago, was still a crime, was still something that the police could charge you for if you had possession or selling. Our job is to transition from this unlicensed cannabis sales into a licensed market. And the unique thing about New York's Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, the MRTA, the unique thing about that is that we're centered in equity. Our entire comprehensive strategy is making sure, for example, the first 300 licenses for retail dispensaries. So people who are going to be opening up the first cannabis dispensary shops are going to be people or the family members of people with cannabis convictions. That's right. So the people who actually suffer from the war on drugs are going to be the first people to get those licenses. And if you want to think about the cultivators, for example, New York uniquely started with small family farms to be the first people to plant those cannabis seeds. In a lot of other states, you see some corporations or maybe these bigger medical operators, but unique to New York, again, remind you, is that equity focus. So that's what OCM is doing, is taking this innovative, unique approach to how can we make the cannabis, pie. There's such a profitable, marketplace to be had. How can we make sure that the most New Yorkers benefit, or at least make sure that the small and medium operators who want to get into the market feel supported to do so?
Right. Well, one of the reactions down here on Long Island when legalization first came about was that quite a few towns, we have town of Oyster Bay, we have the town of Hempstead, and those are comprised of smaller towns. And they chose to opt out. As a legislator, I get that, because if you opt out, you can sit and watch and see what happens, and then you can decide to opt in. But once you've opted in, you cannot opt out.
Yes.
So, okay, they're being cautious. How does that affect the work that you do?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So there's two things I want to start with that. To all the counties, all the areas and, municipalities that opted out, I really do hope that you opt in. I think that New Yorkers are going to be very, very happily surprised when they see what the tax revenue can do for their communities. The reinvestment fund, something again, unique to New York, is making sure that when you actually spend dollars at your local dispensary, those tax dollars aren't going to some huge general fund. They're not going to some other community that you'll never see the profits from. They actually are going to go into a reinvestment fund that's going to be determined by our Cannabis Advisory Board. And we're talking about local leaders. That's not legislatures. That's not people with huge, company interests. They're going to vote on what type of nonprofit grants this is given to, what type of local community projects this is given to. And think about it. And that's, I think say it's 13 cents for every tax dollar. We're just using that for all intents and purposes. 13 cents, that's 4 cents that's going to drug rehabilitation. That's another, I think, 4 cents going into drug prevention. And then you have the remainder going into reinvestment. And you want that money to go into your community. However, that being said, I'm not going to pretend and sit in the world that I understand that everybody is gung-ho about cannabis. I can understand a little bit of the caution. I came from a very, a community that had a lot of hesitation about cannabis legalization. And that's not necessarily saying that people aren't supporting legalization, but they're not necessarily sure they want cannabis in their communities. Right. I hear you. And that's something that OCM takes very seriously. And that's why we allow communities to, opt back in. So I urge you, as soon as you can, opt back in. But that's why OCM is leading with the education first approach to make sure people really understand that we're taking the public health, the public safety component very seriously. And we want to make sure that every community can benefit from that.
Yeah, right. People weren't quite sure, but at one point when marijuana first became legal in New York State, there was kind of a disconnect because I don't think people were aware of, even people using marijuana weren't aware of the idea that technically you're still illegal, because if you're walking down the street smoking it, the next question is, where'd you get it?
Yeah.
Because you didn't get it from any place that was mandated by the state. There aren't any.
Yeah.
To continue with that question, have the amount of drug busts gone down now that we're in the situation we're in?
Yeah, that's so I believe is pardon me for not knowing. It's 2018, I think, is when it was decriminalized, and then in 2021, when the MRTA was passed, that's when cannabis was legalized. Right. Something very important to note. There was a war on drugs. There was a stop and frisk era. There was a time in New York where majority, we can just look at the stats, Black and brown bodies were over-policed during cannabis prohibition. I'm so happy that OCM is a very diverse workplace, whether that be gender, whether it be ethnicity. And something that we're really stressing is, how do we transition into a legal market without returning to these fear-mongering, over-police strategies of doing, quote-unquote, these drug busts, of, going door to door and making people feel unsafe. Mm-hmm. So what we're doing is trying to make it so that what we consider the term legacy community is for people who sold or, were dealt cannabis before legalization. And that's something really we like to stress, is that the legacy community are people from New York. They're Long Islanders who, been around. They understand the community. Just because, they might have dealt in cannabis doesn't mean that they don't want their local schools to be, doing well. Right. Correct. And that's also something important to note that I imagine we'll get to later, is that a lot of these unlicensed storefronts that you're seeing pop up, those are not a part of the legacy community. These random smoke shops that are selling cannabis on your block that you've never seen before, that's not a part of the legacy community. A lot of times we see those as out-of-state operators, people trying to seize up on the public infusion. But kind of going back into your question, when it comes to enforcement, we are making it so that with the Education First campaign, people know that there is an opportunity to start buying licensed cannabis. There is actually a licensed dispensary, and we are actually going to be giving, and I think in 2 weeks' time, more licenses for people across New York State to start opening up more retail shops, because we know people are eager to buy legally. That's something that we've done a lot of community outreach, and we've talked to a lot of people. And what's something that they're really excited about? Being able to purchase safe, tested, legal cannabis as an alternative to the unlicensed cannabis sales they've spent. This is not to re-stigmatize anybody who's currently, selling cannabis or purchasing cannabis on the unlicensed market. It is only to say that public health and safety is the number one important thing. We want to make sure that the product people are consuming is safe and tested. There's been a recent report, I think it came out in December, that they did a random test of product from 20 different smoke shops / unlicensed dispensary in Manhattan. They found E. coli, they found metals, contaminants, things that would not even get close to passing our rigorous safety and testing. Right. So that's just something that we take very seriously.
Right. Well, I think partially what you're up against is people who've been using marijuana for the last 30 years and had a supplier and never had a problem. The newspapers can try to convince them that it's tainted and it's this and it's that, but they have experience. But you're correct. Is the FDA going to get into this at all, or?
So it's important to note that cannabis is still illegal on a federal level and has not been legalized. So a lot of the testing that we're doing is set by our own standards and set with the very data driven. We're in constant communication with other states that are legalized. And the thing about New York is that we want to set the new national standard for how you legalize cannabis. How do you provide safe and tested cannabis? Because a lot of the cannabis that we're actually seeing traded in within the New York unlicensed market is the excess excess product we're getting from other states. And we want to make sure that we have a high standard for everybody. We want to make sure that also to make sure that we answer some of the concerns some parents might have. All of our licensed dispensaries, there's no shot in the world that they're selling this to people under the age of 21. We call it actually adult use cannabis to make sure that everyone understands we're not even using the term recreational marijuana. This is adult use cannabis. And that in addition, that's to separate or make a distinction between the medical cannabis, industry. And that's something that OCM also is overseeing the implementation of a very strong and secure medical operation for those who need medical cannabis. Right. But the adult use cannabis is something we take very seriously, and our dispensaries will ensure they've already done a couple random checks to try to see if somebody younger than 21 can get in, and each of our licensed dispensaries have passed with flying colors. Right.
Well, that's good to know. Any dispensaries in Nassau or Suffolk County?
No, not of yet.
And what is actually legal? Are all forms legal?
There's edibles, there's vape cartridges, there's, the actual flower, the cannabis. There's going to be more products that hit the shelves. So if you do go to our licensed dispensaries and see something that, you're excited for or tried in Colorado that's not there yet, please, stay tuned. We have a lot of cultivators who just started, planting the seeds last year, getting their operations running. Right. I think we have over 250 cultivators as of today, as of like right now. And that's just the first slate of and it's going to be a lot bigger. We're just getting started. Something I like to say is the last 100 years, we had cannabis prohibition. So what OCM has to do is plan to create a bridge that's going to be the infrastructure for the next 100 years of cultivators and the next 100 years of people, entering the market. So, we want to say to everyone, be patient. I know that's really annoying to hear, especially from a government person, and be like, just be patient. But we're working on it, I promise.
You're listening to this week's Long Island News on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name's Bill McIntyre, and today we're talking about the legalization of marijuana and how it affects us here on Long Island. And my guest today is Trivette Knowles, the Public Affairs Press Officer and Manager of Community Outreach at the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. When you were talking about the people who would get licenses and things, and I thought of the Rockefeller drug laws. That was one of the draconian. I think he was trying to be president, and he thought that would catapult him because at that time, traditionally, people who were president were previously the governor of New York. Mm-hmm. That was a line, they thought. So he came out and did this, and I can't imagine how many people went to jail under that. It was like a 3 strikes law, I think. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about for smoking a joint, not importing a ton of cocaine. Yeah. And sadly, in the people importing a ton of cocaine will probably get away with it. The guy smoking the joint is the one who's going to go to jail.
Absolutely.
But now the other question that they had is it legal to have an unlimited supply?
So it depends. If you are traveling out and about in public, you can have a max of 3 ounces of cannabis on you before, it reaches your limits. So then that also goes to how much you can buy at your local store. I believe, having cannabis at your own home is a different matter altogether. But when in transit and on your move, it is a max of 3 ounces.
Right. And the other thing I think we want our listeners to know, I interviewed the police commissioner, and one of the things he said was every time he goes to get on the parkway, he'll roll down his window and he said, "That's the first place I smell it." And we let our audience know that that's probably the one place you're not allowed to use it. And I believe it's even sitting in a car, even if it's not operable, you probably shouldn't be sitting in your car smoking marijuana.
Absolutely. I have to say, I know I'm a government employee. There's a difference between legality and also doing the smart thing, right? We don't want, I was a black person before I joined OCM, and I'm a black person afterwards. If my mom heard I was smoking cannabis in a car, she would scold me. Right. She'd scold me if I was smoking cannabis altogether. But, if she ever in the car, just be safe, be smart in those ways. You don't want, you have an interact with law enforcement and they can smell a substance on you, even if it's your peer and that's not you. So I would recommend and don't do it. I do think it goes against rules and regulations as well, but just be smart about it. Right. The rule of thumb is anywhere that you can smoke a cigarette, you can smoke cannabis. But just also remember to people, I want everyone to remember that, again, it's not legalized federally. So what that means is it's still a Schedule 1 drug. Right. If you go to, say you live in a NYCHA housing building, you can't consume or store it there. It's still, to your point, some of these draconian laws is according to the government, they think heroin is on the same level as cannabis, right? So we got to work within the system we have. We work with our executive director, Chris Alexander. He was a cannabis activist, and he's, cannabis legalization activist, and he's pushing to make sure some of these equitable, visions in the MRTA will eventually go into a national landscape. And we're going to have to fight that battle of getting cannabis removed from that Schedule 1 classification.
I personally don't see what advantage the government gets from keeping it a Schedule 1, other than it's something else to hold over somebody's head. But and one of the downsides of that is that legitimate labs and scientists really can't study it.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah. I mean, actually this past earlier this month in March, we just, passed the first, the Cannabis Control Board, the CCB, passed regulations to where we're going to start the process in which OCM in the state of New York can start doing case studies, can start doing more research on cannabis and the wonderful effects that THC can have when it comes to medicinal effects, can come to calming effects. I imagine everybody has an anecdote of somebody they know either who suffered PTSD or who has stress or anxiety, who needs pain relief, that cannabis works well for them. I can speak, very confidently that a lot of people in the Black community that I've grown up with, when the equity team, we have an equity department here at OCM, and our chief equity officer, Damian Fagan, he actually invited me to go to some of these equity roundtables where we met with New Yorkers of all different types of communities and ethnicities. And he brought me along to the service disabled veterans, specifically of color. And I sat at a table where there is women of color who served our country but didn't qualify for some of the veteran affairs benefits because they were told that they don't qualify. And they said they use cannabis as a medicine. They suffered very tragic, situations and scenarios, and they didn't quite know how to cope with it. But they knew that when they, consumed cannabis, they felt able to better participate in their community and go outside. And if sometimes they heard sirens or even some gunshots, they wouldn't be triggered to a past that they didn't want to be associated with any longer. Yeah. So when I hear stories like that, that's when I recognize that we need to do more to not only just take it away from Schedule 1, but to do the research to figure out how can cannabis help the people on the ground right now. And we know it can. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm aware of quite a few people who would use that for anxiety. But the big one that I saw, and it's a shame because this had to be done by a family, and that they discovered it. One of their children had epilepsy, and with epilepsy at times comes seizures.
Yeah.
They would use cannabis, and I mean, to watch the video is stunning because it went away like that.
Yeah, it almost feels like a miracle drug at times.
And so to me, it's just a shame that you see an event like that and the effect that it had, and yet, okay, we have to leave it there. We can't continue because what other things could it affect and help people with?
Absolutely. There's so many stories of children. I got to meet one family when we did our cannabis cultivation farm tour. We went to different farms across New York and got to meet with some of these, small business farmers. And there was one, his name was Todd. He talked about the effects it had on his child. She had terrible stomach pains and constipation, and it just a little bit of THC, he said, changed the entire way his relationship with his daughter was affected. She no longer had to deal with pain. She could enjoy her youth. There's another study I found out from our medical team that there is a young child, she was mute. And then, with the droplet of THC, she, regained the ability to communicate verbally. And you hear these types of stories. And again, I want everyone to know, when I first joined OCM, I joined in March of 2022. I was one of the first, I think, of 20 to 25 employees. I did not come as a cannabis expert. I don't actually consume cannabis any longer because it doesn't work for me the way it does others. But what I do love is what cannabis can do for communities and people who need it and use it responsibly. So I'm coming now as an advocate for something that doesn't necessarily I get to enjoy my personal life, but I see the benefits. So I want everyone to know that this isn't just a bunch of Doobie Brothers over here, but these are people who have learned and seen the benefits, and we're working in tandem. So I'm really grateful to be exposed to people like Todd, to some of our cultivators. There's thousands of good stories I can't wait to share. It's so many great things happening here in the state of New York.
Yeah, well, that's great. You're the guy. You'll get the opportunity to put those out. We get to see them. And Again, from the government guy, which is, refreshing.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. I didn't know when this job was starting. I thought, it might be a little corny or cheesy. Like, how is New York going to actually deal with cannabis legalization? But when I met with the team, they're like, we want to change the way we do this. Tagline we use is, we're doing government differently. I can't explain to you how many people I've interacted with on the ground. And they say, outside from the IRS and outside from the police, this is the first time I've ever interacted with government.
Yeah, right,
and that just, it's crazy to hear people say that. And that's from all different ethnicities, income classes. They're just surprised that New York is actually trying to work with people.
Well, that's another big question, though, is, some have tried, and like growers, I'll use them as the example because apparently they were the first ones to be affected by this. They couldn't put their money in the bank.
Yes.
How was your agency? I mean, do you guys get involved in that somehow to facilitate the running of a business? I mean, you covered everything else: distribution, packaging, growing. How do we deal with this?
That's something that's on the forefront of a lot of our minds. I will tell you right now, there's smarter people than me in the agency dealing with those business ventures. But when we have meetings, what they've enlightened me to is that we're trying to support every single part of our marketplace and all of our operators. And by doing so, we know that the biggest challenge and hurdle, especially from people from communities disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, is how do they have the resources and capital to start their own business? Right. So what we've done is we go out and we want to go to people, financial institutions who we consider safe bets, to invest in these operators, to make these grants available. Actually, when you look at our CARD program, and that's CARD as in Conditional Adult Use Retail Dispensary Program, that program that we launched in partnership with DASNY, that's the Dormitory Authority State of New York, our DASNY sister agency, we created a whole entire program to where the first 150 licensees for the retail dispensary licenses, we were actually going to financially give them an investment. We were going to give them a very small interest loan. We're actually building out the dispensaries for some of these applicants. We had a dispensary open in Manhattan and here in New York City called Smack Village, right? And when we went out there, they worked with DASNY, they worked with OCM, and this young man who was, he loved, I call him young man, but he's a young man. He had his whole family together, and he is opening this campaign in a family operation, and he had business experience. He had the opportunity to come and be a community leader, specifically because what OCM is doing through this equity lens is looking at what problems actually face people and entrepreneurs. And it's not the know-how. It's not the education or the intelligence. We know there's so many smart people in the communities that need help. What they need help with is the finance, the resources. And I think everyone has always talked about doing that. Everyone from the history of time is like, we need to really start with equality and equity. But I'm really happy to say that we're doing government differently and applying a lot of those principles on the ground. We're the first to do something like this. So also hear me, we're going to have some, blunders along the way, but I'm happy that we're an agency that can just straight up say it. The first card license program, we started with 150. We were only going to give the first 150 retail dispensary licenses to people with cannabis convictions. But we heard the support and the outpouring of people saying they wanted more. There are more entrepreneurs who are ready, who have the classifications and the talent. And you know what we did? We listened to the people and we doubled the program. I'm proud to work at an agency that listens to the people, listens to New Yorkers. And, I'm really excited about that.
I hear that. How does somebody apply to get a license? Or let's just say I don't want to be a grower and I don't want to. Could I figure out how to get product and resell it?
I'm really happy you asked that. So this first slate of licenses, this card program and some of these conditional cultivators and processing license, that is a small slither of the amount of licensures that's going to come into New York, right? So this is just a small percentage. We're actually opening up general licensing for the entire public in Q3, later half of this year. So I want everyone to know that they're going to have an opportunity. We're creating it so that something really cool and unique to New York is that we have something called a 2-tier market system. So that means that the retail side of cannabis is going to be separate from the supply side. So we're making it so that we can maximize the amount of small and medium operators who enter the market. So that means that cultivators and there's going to be more processors. It's going to be very similar to your wine shop, to where you go to your winery, your local wine shop, and there's people recommending you brands you've never heard of. So they want you to have a personal relationship to that brand. We're going to actually our cannabis market is going to resemble that. And why I bring that up is there's not going to be one big brand that takes up all of the market space or the shelf space. We're specifically creating a market so that people who do want to apply for a license, and that's coming in the second half of the year, will feel that they have opportunity to actually enter the market. They're going to have as low, barriers to entry as possible. And those licensures will happen. So something I want to emphasize to everybody is you don't have to have a dispensary to make money in the cannabis market.
Right.
We're trying to make sure that is, you don't have to have a farm to make money in the cannabis market.
Right.
I know in Colorado, there's this example of a business. They don't even touch the plant or cannabis altogether. You know what they do? They pick up hazmat suits and the safety precautions tools and clean them and bring them back to the dispensaries and the processors. I want everyone to know that the skills you have right now, instead of trying to relearn an entire new craft, think about how you can utilize your skill for the upcoming, soon to be completely, general licensing period, whether that's social media, whether that's accounting, whether that's learning how to install a ventilation system.
Right.
Those are the ways we want really the people to think. We got to think bigger than just a retail dispensary, shiny objects. There's so much money to be made. There's so much opportunity to be seized. And we're trying to work with you to make sure you get those opportunities.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Sounds very good. I'm kind of glad you're sitting there in that seat. I feel better.
Thank you.
Yeah, because we hear about these things, but we don't see any action. We don't see any. So people kind of get, the other thing that I would always want to tell, like you, but you got a handle on it. The governor here in New York at one time was telling us how much an ounce of weed was supposed to go for. And I thought, this is ludicrous. You told me that you asked the experts, and now I got the governor telling me the answer. He's not an expert. I said the government could just price them out of the market. They have competition, and that's every yokel standing on a street corner at nighttime, or however you want to visualize that.
Yeah.
And so whatever you're offering better be better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Otherwise, your clientele is going to stick with what they've had for the last 50 years.
Absolutely. And we recognize that competition. Next month, we're starting a campaign called the Why Buy Legal campaign. And, essentially what we want you to do is break up with your current dealer and join to the legal market. But let me tell the dealers, we're not forgetting you too. We want you to transition into the legal market as well.
Get legal.
So we're doing a lot of initiatives for that.
They could get legal. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you. My guest today has been Trivette Knowles, the Public Affairs Press Officer and Manager of Community Outreach at the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. And thanks for taking the time to educate us on the topic. And I'm sure there's a bunch else we could talk about too. We don't get that much time. But thank you, and we'll definitely talk again.
Absolutely, Bill. Thank you for having me.
You got to promise you'll come back, yeah.
Absolutely. I will.
Very good, very good. Thank you. So now the clock on the wall says it's time for this week's Long Island News to get on out of here. I'm Bill McIntyre. Remember, you can listen to us by searching for This Week's Long Island News wherever you listen to podcasts. And we are right here on the radio every Friday at 3 p.m. on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.